In this video, I'm going to be talking about tips for creating effective tables for research papers. In this class, you are going to be creating tables for the research project that we're working on for your senior project. So I hope that this presentation is helpful in kind of providing a refresher on the things to include in tables and how to set those up. So data tables for research articles are really important. Research studies often cover large amounts of data and are obviously very text-heavy documents. So it's important for your data to be presented to the reader in a visually appealing way. Your reader should be able to understand the table without reading the whole results section and the manuscript and its entirety. The purpose of these tables is really to support the communication of your key findings. So research papers have tables as well as figures. And you might be wondering, well, when do I use a table versus a figure? We use both of these when we're writing research papers, but they serve very different purposes. So tables are typically used for reporting numerical data in some sort of organized manner. And figures are different because they're used for a different purpose. So they might be used to reveal trends in your data and to highlight maybe, for example, changes over time. So they're used for different purposes. Your paper doesn't have to include a figure if you have tables. Whether or not you're including tables or figures really depends. It depends on the types of analyses that you're conducting and what it is that you need to display in terms of your results. But the data presented in tables should not be duplicated in figures or graphs and vice versa. So they should display completely separate things. Before we jump into tables, I did mention in the last slide that figures are usually used to reveal trends or display some sort of visual changes in time. So I pulled an example from an article that I was a co-author on that looked at changes in PAP testing and HPV vaccinations kind of before and after the Affordable Care Act. And this was a figure that we included in the table, and you can see that the main purpose of this figure is to show changes in time. So this figure shows essentially the percent of the respondents who reported PAP test participation, so ever having a PAP test adherence, so actually adhering to the testing guidelines. And then also we have HPV vaccination participation, so having at least one HPV vaccination shots, and then HPV vaccination adherence, so having all of the recommended shots. And you can see from this figure how this changes over time. So these lines are labeled according to this key here, and you can see that this is time point 1 pre-ACA, and this is time point 2, this is post-ACA. And so you can see that some of these declined kind of pre and post ACA, while some of these other behaviors increased pre and post ACA. So this is a nice example that just shows kind of the purpose of a figure, how these behaviors have changed over time. You can't really effectively communicate this information in a table, therefore a figure was a better way to communicate this particular information showing changes in the trends in data. So for your senior project and this research study, you're going to be focusing on creating tables. We're not really going to be working on figures. So you might be wondering, what tables should you include in a research study? So journals have their own limits typically on the number of figures and tables that can be included. So once you identify a target journal, you have to adhere to that target journal's submission guidelines. So they might say you can only have a maximum of 4 figures and tables. So you have to kind of be strategic about what tables and figures you're going to include based on whatever those guidelines are. Typically in a public health related research paper, we usually see that the first table is table 1 And this first table is going to include descriptive statistics of the participant characteristics, meaning that it's going to show the descriptive statistics of the people who were actually included in your study. This table 1 is meant to tell your audience, these are the people that were included in this particular research study. Whatever data you have available on them, you're going to describe that data in that table 1. So it might list the different demographic characteristics of your participants to help your reader understand who exactly was included and what do these people look like. You might have other tables as well that display maybe the main results of your main analysis that you conducted. There's not really a right or wrong number of tables. It really will be study dependent and really depend on what it is that you're analyzing and what kind of main outcomes you're looking at. But regardless of how many tables and figures you include in a research paper, they should be labeled according to the order that they appear in the text of the paper. So in your results section, you typically start off by talking about the descriptive statistics of the people who were included in your study, so your research participants. So that is going to be your table 1. Your table 1 is going to appear first in your research paper. So therefore, that table talking about the descriptive statistics of your participants, that is going to be labeled table 1. So they should always appear in the order that they appear in the text of the paper. The best way to set up tables, regardless of what table you're setting up, the best way to set up tables in general is to use Microsoft Word and the table function in there. So there is an example paper on Canvas that I posted from a paper that I published that used BRFIS data, and there's some data tables in there that I want to go over to kind of give you an example of what I'm looking for in terms of setting up your tables so you have kind of a guide to go off of. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to go over those tables as well. If you haven't done so already, please make sure that you do read through the PDF of that paper. I think it will be really helpful. So this is the table 1 from the example paper that I have provided. And again, your table 1 is going to want to include the descriptive statistics of the participants in your research study. So in this particular table, this is essentially the characteristics of all of the people that we have included in this research study. So we've got them listed kind of overall, and then I have them broken down by the outcome variable. So in this particular example, we were looking at racial and ethnic disparities in health and life insurance denial among cancer survivors. So my outcome in this particular study was whether or not someone had been denied health or life insurance. So I've got my overall column here. This is everyone in my that are my participants in my study. And then I also have this broken down by the outcome variable. Now I set this up this way so you could see kind of, what this looks like overall for everyone in this research study, but also so you could see how these different variables, whether or not they were associated with my outcome variable, to see if there were differences across the two groups in terms of being denied insurance and never being denied insurance. And then what that looks like if they were different in terms of maybe their sex, their age, their race, ethnicity, their income, all of these variables that are included here on this side of the screen. You'll also notice that there is a p-value column here. And so that is essentially what it's saying is whether or not the differences between these two groups, being denied insurance versus never being denied, whether these groups were had a statistically significant difference in terms of one another. So now that you hopefully kind of understand the layout of this table, I want to go over just a few things. So notice first off that this table has a very descriptive title. It's labeled Table 1, so you can clearly see that, again, because it's the first table that's described in the text. Notice that the actual text up here in the table, the title of the table, it tells you exactly what that table is displaying without the reader having to actually refer back to the text. So if it just said Table 1, if I were to pick up this paper, I would have really no clear understanding of what this is. Instead, it says Table 1, weighted percentages and unweighted counts of respondent demographics among cancer survivors by self-reported denial of health or life insurance, and then the years. And also notice that it tells me the sample size. So this is the total number of people that I'm describing in this table. Notice that the columns are individual columns. So in my Word document, these are set up as individual columns. They are clearly labeled. So at the top, you can see this is the overall, that's very clear. I have it by my outcomes, so denied insurance, never denied insurance, and then what this value is here, that's the p-value. Also notice that the numbers that appear in the columns are labeled at the top. So for example, this overall, this is the percent and the N. So the number that comes here for this particular demographic variable for sex, I know that this first number here is going to be the percent, and then this number here is going to be the N. And then notice here I've got the percent again, and then I've got the row N. So meaning that this is the number of people who identified as male, this is the number here, and then the number of people who identified as male, this is the number here, broken out by these two different categories. But these are clearly labeled as percents and N's, so when I'm looking at these numbers here, I know exactly what I'm looking at. Also notice that the variables are included on the left side, these demographic variables. And also notice that they're included in their final form. So what I mean by their final form is the way in which the variable options are displayed. This is how they were included in the final analyses. So for example, let's say that when I collected my data, I originally had let's say 10 categories for income. After looking at my data, I then decided to collapse these into these 4 categories. And when I collapsed them into the 4 categories, this is how I included them in my final analysis. Therefore, when I display the results of the demographics of this variable, it should be displayed in the 4 categories, not the original 10 categories that were included in terms of when I first collected this data. So it should be in their final form. It should be very clear in terms of what these are, in terms of the actual variable and then the different response options, so the reader knows exactly what they are. So sometimes we have to include units. If we were looking, for example, at sleep duration, we might want to specify that that's in hours. So you always want to be very specific in terms of what these variables are, so your reader knows exactly what they are. Also notice that there are some footnotes at the bottom of the table. So sometimes we include things in our table, but we don't really have space to explain what they are. So the footnotes are really important because this is where you can put explanations of things that might be unclear in your table. So for example, we have this p-value. Well, I've got a p-value here that's showing that basically whether or not there's a statistically significant difference between these two groups here. So whether there is a statistically significant difference in the sex of people who were denied insurance versus the people who were never denied insurance. When I look at this table and I see this p-value, I can tell from this p-value whether there's a statistically significant difference, but as the reader, I don't know what test was used to evaluate this difference between the groups. So I've included an asterisk here, and then I can tell my reader here that I used chi-square tests, right? So it says chi-square p-value. That tells my reader that I used chi-square tests to examine differences among these two groups according to these different demographic characteristics. Also notice I did this with the race ethnicity variable. So for the other non-Hispanic, I don't know what that means as a reader, right? So I need to tell my audience what exactly this other non-Hispanic is, and I do that here by including a footnote with the 2 asterisks that says other includes, and then I've defined what that is for my reader. Some other formatting comments. Notice the borders on the table. They appear only at the top and the bottom of the table. There's no borders included across the different columns. That would be very odd. Your table should be formatted in terms of the borders that are used in this example table. So please make sure to follow this example. Also notice that there's no shading, there's no colors that are used. You want to stay away from those kinds of things. Also notice that all of the numbers are consistent in terms of decimal places. So if you're going to go with 2 numbers after that decimal point, you want to be consistent throughout your entire table. So notice that, for example, the 2 decimal points here, that's used pretty much throughout this entire table. All of that should kind of match in terms of being uniform and consistent. So the next table is the table 2 from the example paper. This table is displaying the results from my main analysis. And my main analysis in this paper was, again, examining the association between race and ethnicity and being denied insurance. So I've got, you can see my main independent variable here. I've got my both unadjusted regression model results, and then I have my adjusted regression model results. And so this tells me whether or not there's an association between my independent variable and my dependent variable using logistic regression. So what you'll notice again is this table has a descriptive title. It's labeled table 2 because it's the second table described in the text. The title tells you exactly what the table is displaying without the reader having to refer back to the text. So again, if this said table 2, you wouldn't really know what that means. Or if it just said table 2, unadjusted and adjusted odds ratios, we wouldn't know what that means. It very specifically says that it's the unadjusted and adjusted odds ratios for the association between race, ethnicity, and life insurance coverage denial. So it's very clear in terms of what the results are, in terms of what analysis has been conducted. Again, notice that the columns are individual columns that are clearly labeled. At the top, you can see here, it tells you this is my unadjusted odds ratio and my 95% confidence interval. This is my p-value. This is my adjusted odds ratio and the 95% confidence interval and the p-value. Notice that the variables included in the logistic regression models, they are listed on the left side. These are the independent variables that were included in the models. You should not be displaying your outcome variable because that's your outcome variable. You want the independent variables that were included in your model displayed here. Notice that the 1.0 is used to indicate that the variable option is the reference group. So what this means is that we're looking at the odds of being denied health insurance, the outcome. We're looking at the odds across the different values of race and ethnicity. So for example, what this means is that the white non-Hispanic group, that's our reference group. We're comparing all the other categories of race and ethnicity to that group of white non-Hispanic individuals. So for example, compared to white non-Hispanic individuals, Black non-Hispanic individuals have an odds ratio of 3.08 in terms of being denied insurance. So they're 3 times as likely to be denied health or life insurance compared to those who are white. And we see that this is a statistically significant association in this unadjusted model, both with my confidence interval as well as my p-value. Notice again that there's footnotes at the bottom of the table. So in my adjusted model, it was recommended that I adjust for survey year. I don't need to display that in my table because it's not really a relevant variable. So I put a footnote here that the adjusted model includes adjusting for variables that are in this table and also for survey year. Again, I've also defined the other non-Hispanic category down here as well, where I've got the 2 asterisks and I've defined it here. Even if you've defined something earlier on in your paper or in another table, you should define it again. You don't want to have anything that's unclear in your tables. Again, notice the formatting, the borders, you've got just the lines up here at the top and here at the bottom. And then also notice that all the numbers are consistent in terms of those decimal places. So you're going to be working on developing tables for our research study. In terms of next steps, here's what you can expect. In week 6, you are going to develop templates for the tables. So you'll develop a table 1 template and also a table 2 template, just as we talked about in the example paper. The templates that you submit are not worth any points. I want to be a source of help for you, and so you'll submit those templates. They don't need to include any numbers. They're literally just going to be templates that are set up, and that will provide an opportunity for me to give you feedback on your work so you can make any necessary changes so that the following week, in week 7, you're going to actually fill out those tables with numbers and complete the tables and submit those for points. Hopefully this video was helpful. If you have any questions on setting up tables for your submission, just let me know. I am happy to help.